let's talk about a patient that I saw yesterday. Actually, we're not going to talk about her. We're going to talk about her friend. So had a patient come in yesterday. She's been coming in for a couple weeks now, post-op bilateral hemi knee replacements. She's kind of young, like late 40s, maybe early 50s, but doing pretty well. And she had obviously knee pain for a long time that drove her to get the replacements. And she had previous physical therapy elsewhere that didn't work, shockingly enough. So she brought in a friend with her because her friend is scheduled to have at least one, possibly two total knees done in about 3 to 4 weeks. So she wanted to bring in a friend to show her what we're doing and how it's different than what her friend also went through in conventional PT before. So in the hopes that her friend would schedule her post-op rehab with us. So as I'm running my patient through the screen and put her on the table and start going through NFTs and palpations, I'm explaining a little bit out loud to the patient that's watching. But before I started to explain things to her, I asked her some questions. So, what's going on with your knees? And the first thing that she told me is, she said, well, yeah, no, it's kind of my fault because I failed physical therapy. I said, really? That's interesting. How did you, the patient, fail physical therapy? And she said, well, I didn't feel like the exercises were like helping me. They actually felt like they were kind of making me worse. So I really didn't work as hard on the exercises as I should have. I said, that's not you failing physical therapy. That's your physical therapist failing you. They gave you the wrong exercises. You were smart enough not to do them. Okay. So that's not your fault. And she said, oh. And then I said, so what's going on with your knees? Oh, well, they hurt. They're just bad. And I went to the doctor. So she failed physical therapy 5 or 6 years ago after she had a scope on one of the knees. And I said, well, how many times? And she said, I didn't go to physical therapy enough. And I said, well, how many times did you go to physical therapy after you had the scope? And she said, maybe 20. I said, 20? You went to physical therapy 20 times after a scope. And she said, well, I don't know. It might have been like 15. I said, there's absolutely no way that you should have went to physical therapy for 15 to 20 visits and not got better after a scope. And then she said, well, it actually felt like I was getting worse. And the physical therapist said, well, maybe we should take a break and let this settle down, calm down your swelling and your pain. So I said, well, what were they doing with you at physical therapy? She said, oh, well, they were making me walk up and down the stairs. And I said, did they do anything before that? And she said, oh, well, yeah, they had me do squats. And I said, well, did they do anything before that? Well, yeah, they had me do the little bike pedals that are on the floor. Huh. I said, anything before that? Well, yeah, they really worked on getting had me lay down and really worked on getting my range of motion back. And I said, okay, so once again, your physical therapist failed you because they never got to the root cause of your problem. All of the cranking on you flared things up because that's irritating because your knee is trying to tell them, stop doing that. I can't do that. And then when they gave you exercise, if the exercises were irritating you and making you worse, that's because they never did what I'm doing here with your friend. So I said, did they ever do what I'm doing here with your friend? And she said, no, that looks really different. And I said, and then her friend looks up and looks at her and goes, yeah, because it is. And then, so I said, so hold on to your thoughts there. Let's circle back on this. So I got done working with the patient and I said, so the knee that you're having replaced isn't the knee that you had the scope on. And she said, no, I've never had any surgery on this knee. And I said, okay, so what have you been doing for that knee? And she said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, did your doctor send you to physical therapy and say, try to do this before you have surgery? She said, no, I just went to the doctor and told him my knee hurt. He took an x-ray, said, yeah, there's arthritis there. We'll have to replace it. Okay. So I said, okay, gotcha. So I finish up with her friend and have her friend stand up and do squats and single leg squats. And she's like, wow, that's fantastic. I wish I could do that. And her friend looks at her and said, well, I couldn't do this before surgery and I couldn't do this 2 weeks ago. I can do it now though. And it's actually pretty easy and it feels good. Like I like squatting now. So her friend was like, wow, yeah, that's just mind blowing, but I've got this surgery and I just have to figure out where I'm going to go. And I said, so she said, I already have physical therapy scheduled at my doctor's. And she said, I already have physical therapy scheduled. And I said, oh, at your surgeon's physical therapist? And she said, yeah. And I said, okay, so let's review here. Your surgeon didn't send you to physical therapy before surgery, just scheduled surgery. And is the surgeon in the same clinic that you went to physical therapy for after your scope? And she said, yeah, it's the same group, same physical therapy clinic. I said, does that sound like a good idea? She goes, well, I'm not excited to do this. And I said, okay, well, let's try something. So I put her on the table and test 2 or 3 quads. She fails. And she's like, yeah, I just don't have any strength. I can't do that. And her knee shifts. I can feel it shift. So treat the first one, retest, stable, strong. I said, how's that feel? She goes, yeah, I think that was stronger. I said, okay, did that feel like your knee like cracked and moved? And she goes, no, I don't think so. I said, okay. So I did 2 more muscles, same thing. How was that? Yeah, that felt better. What'd you do? I said, I did the same thing that I did to your friend. So I treated 2 or 3 muscles on one leg, the bad leg, had her get back up and said, okay, just walk and see what that feels like. So she's walking and she's like, yeah, I feel like I can feel, and I said, stable? And she goes, yeah, like my knee is stable. She said, I haven't felt like that for years. And I said, okay, well, how about squatting down? She goes, well, I can't squat. I said, try to squat and see what happens. So she does a double leg squat down to 90 and she slowly goes like, when you see somebody like getting into cold water and they're not sure how cold it is, so they go slow, but it's not as cold as they thought, so they keep going into the water. That's what she does on her squat. So she's going down. I said, keep going. She goes, really? And I said, yeah, keep going. Like if it doesn't hurt, keep going. She gets down to 90 and then comes right back up and she's looking at me like, what in the hell? And I was like, did that feel better? She goes, I haven't been able to do that. I said, okay, now let's do a single leg squat. She goes, you mean on one foot? I said, yeah, you can touch the table for balance. Do your good side first. So she does that one. She goes, that hurts. And I said, okay, now do the other one. She goes, but the other one's the bad one. I said, I know, do the other one. So she touches the table. She does 3 little short leg squats and goes, that doesn't hurt. This bad knee feels better than the good knee. And I said, that's because I didn't do anything to the good knee. I only worked on the bad knee. She goes, okay, so now I understand. Okay, so and then she said, well, I have to get my doctor to refer me over here. And I said, you're Medicare. Your doctor is going to give you a referral. You can take that anywhere you want. Bring it over here, schedule your appointments now. I said, schedule your appointments now before surgery, and let me see if we can get you to the point where maybe you don't need surgery. She goes, well, what would I do if I don't need surgery? And I said, you would go back to your normal life with the knees that you have and do what you want to do without having a problem. Like that's the goal. And she's like, oh, I didn't know that was possible. And I said, well, obviously, it's not possible with your doctor because he didn't even want you to try physical therapy before surgery. So this is how you educate people and demonstrate as you educate, which is what we covered in day 3 of the challenge. So I know you were in the challenge, right? Hopefully you're in the challenge because I went into a whole bunch of detail on day 3 about patient education related to science, physiology, anatomy, biomechanics, all that stuff to educate them while you are treating them so they understand what you're doing and what the effect is. So that's how you get patients. I don't get patients by going to fun runs. I don't get patients by running ads. I don't get patients by knocking on doors and annoying people. I get patients by patients bringing people in or telling people, go see this guy. That's how quality elite clinicians who get results get patients. If you want to learn how to do that and you want to get people to stop going to garbage PT and you want to change our profession so everybody's doing the same thing and we actually look like real doctors instead of the made up crap that we get out of PT school, make sure you're in the shift. Make sure maybe you ask me if there's any way that I could give you the link for the 3-day challenge because you didn't sign up for it, I might be able to give you the link. You may be able to watch those 3 days of videos. Now, you're not going to qualify for the special offer, either special offer that I had, the sale offer or the free offer that I offered at the end of day 3, but at least you can watch the videos and see what you are missing.